Welcome back to chessopenings.com. Today's video focuses on an interesting reply to the Queen's Gambit known as the Chigorin Defense. The Chigorin Defense begins with the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and now the move knight to c6. And with the Chigorin Defense, Black is hoping to offset the pressure to his d5 pawn with pressure against the d4 pawn. And since the Chigorin Defense is not as popular as other replies to the Queen's Gambit, such as pawn to c6, the Slav defense, and pawn to e6, the Queen's Gambit decline, since the move knight c6 is not as popular, adherents of the Chigorin Defense are often banking on the fact that White will not be quite as prepared for this opening, which often does get sharp and quite unusual in its strategic implications. We'll get a chance to see all of that and more, and also look at whether or not White has an advantage today in this video. Let's take a look. The Chigorin Defense arises out of the Queen's Gambit, which begins with the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and pawn to c4. With the Queen's Gambit, White takes advantage of his extra move in the opening to create immediate pressure against Black's central pawn on d5. White's threat is to immediately capture on d5, followed by knight c3, for example, queen takes d5 and knight to c3, gaining time at the expense of the queen and achieving further control over the center so that White would probably play the move pawn to e4 on the next move. So no matter how Black replies to this threat to his d5 pawn, each response tends to create a slight issue that he will struggle to resolve for some time to come. The Chigorin Defense continues with the unusual move knight to c6, which applies pressure to the d4 pawn. By doing this, Black handles the threat of pawn takes pawn on d5 in a unique way, since after pawn takes pawn on d5 and queen takes d5, White cannot immediately challenge the queen with the move knight to c3 because the pawn on d4 is threatened directly by the queen. This tactical feature is the direct consequence of Black's early movement of the knight to c6. So backing up to the position before pawn takes pawn, what makes Black's decision to play knight c6 so unusual is that it goes against a well-known principle of queen-pawn openings, which states that neither side should obstruct the c-pawn with a knight move. By interfering with the c-pawn's ability to contribute to the game, Black intensifies his potential problems in the center. In particular, he lacks the opportunity to play the defensive move c7 to c6, which is often an important part of many defensive schemes in the Queen's Gambit. Black must make sure he exploits the unique possibilities presented by his early move knight to c6, or he risks gaining an inferior Queen's Gambit position where the clumsy placement of the knight, coupled with the inability to play the move pawn to c6, can lead to some serious discomfort in the center. Now, White has three main options here. While the option of pawn takes pawn in the center, c takes d5, is playable, there are two other natural developing moves which trump the central pawn exchange in popularity. One idea is to develop the queen's knight with knight to c3. With this approach, White increases the pressure on d5, aiming to force a concession. Another approach we'll examine is the move knight to f3, and this is the slight favorite for White in this position in terms of popularity, continuing development and simply protecting the d4 pawn. By securing the pawn on d4, White renews the threat to capture on d5, since after the queen recaptures on d5, White is now prepared to gain time with the immediate move knight to c3. Let's begin with the move pawn takes pawn on d5 as an excellent means to introduce some of the possibilities Black is working with. After the move pawn takes d5, Black replies queen takes d5, putting immediate pressure on the d4 pawn, which necessitates defense by White. Now White can play either the move pawn to e3 to defend on d4, or knight to f3, and both have been tried. Now, for example, after the move knight to f3, white is ready to play knight to c3, achieving the coveted move e2 to e4 after attacking the queen with tempo. Because of the severity of this threat, black must act in a vigorous fashion in order to do something about this threat, and he will need to do so in a way that involves the potentialities that are given to him by the unusual placement of his knight on c6. Black finds just the vigorous approach he needs in the move pawn to e5, which not only increases the pressure on the d4 pawn, but also has the additional benefit of opening the f8 to a3 diagonal for the dark squared bishop, which immediately comes into handy as soon as white plays knight to c3, as he often does. And now black has the move bishop to b4, pinning the knight on c3, avoiding the threat for the time being to the queen on d5, and continuing to keep up the threat on the d4 pawn. In this position, white can still argue that after the main line, bishop to d2, bishop takes c3, and bishop takes c3, and now pawn to e4, black can still argue that he has gained the bishop pair. But practice and analysis show that black's compensation for the bishop pair is impressive. In the first place, he has achieved a decent development of his forces. And after white repositions his knight either to e5 or to d2, both sides will have developed two pieces with black having the right to move. Thus, black has managed to gain some time in development in exchange for his bishop pair. Just as crucially, the advanced e-pawn itself gives black a very important possibility to advance to e3, a possibility which he tends to make use of no matter how white replies. For example, after the clever move knight to d2, which appears to lose a pawn on d4, but in fact does not, since after the move knight takes d4, there would be e3, both looking at this g7 pawn and preparing also bishop to c4, or perhaps even more straightforward, much more straightforward, is also knight b3. Both moves offering advantage to white. So after the move knight to d2, it appears that white would be getting close to an advantage since he's close to playing the move pawn to e3 and bishop to c4, when the bishop pair will speak for itself and any of black's development advantage will be lost due to the necessity of moving the queen a second time. But here, black is able to deliver a cold shower with the interesting move pawn to e3, followed by f takes e3 and knight to f6, controlling the e4 square and continuing development. This is a powerful obstruction sacrifice which prevents white from moving his e2 pawn and which in turn limits the potential of the light squared bishop. While the assessment of this position is not totally clear, I believe that black has adequate compensation for the pawn, and analysis seems to support this conclusion. For having opened in such an irregular fashion, these positions have to be considered a success for black, since he has managed to create an unusual and imbalanced situation in which the assessment of the position does not seem to be against black in any way. I would also note that black does quite well even without this pawn sacrifice with pawn to e3, simply playing knight to f6, e3, and castles, since the bishop's movement to c4 still leads to problems after the move queen to g5. For example, the main line has typically continued queen c2, rook e8, bishop c4, and black has nevertheless achieved an equal position after the move queen to g5, since he has counter-attacking chances on the king side and a strong advanced pawn on e4. Thus, after the move knight to f3 and pawn to e5, black appears to have good chances of achieving an unclear, imbalanced game, since the pressure on the d4 pawn, in addition to the opportunity to remove any knight that appears at c3, give him fair chances. The same goes if white tries the move pawn to e3, when black again replies in very similar fashion with simply pawn to e5, planning to eliminate any knight which arrives at c3 with the move bishop to b4. And perhaps it's for these reasons that white generally does not play c takes d5. It's the least popular of the three popular options. Once it's identified that pawn takes pawn on d5 offers white some tactical issues, it makes a lot of sense to look at the natural developing moves. And I believe that both of the moves, knight to f3 and knight to c3, continue to offer white some serious chances for the initiative. If white plays the move knight to f3, he's simply defending the pawn on d4, and he thereby reinstates the threat to play pawn takes pawn on d5, followed by knight to c3. Once again, black needs to handle this issue by stepping up the pressure on the d4 pawn, this time doing it with the move bishop to g4, a move which is universally played here. By attacking the knight on f3, black is immediately attacking the defender to the d4 pawn, so that after the move pawn takes pawn on d5, which is generally played, black now inserts the move bishop takes f3, removing the defender to the d4 pawn. It's possible for white to play the move d takes c6, but after bishop takes c6, black already has equal chances. Instead, white generally plays the move g takes f3, snagging the bishop pair. And now, black plays queen takes d5, again threatening the d4 pawn. White defends with the move pawn to e3, and now once again black makes use of a motif we've seen earlier. He simply plays the direct move pawn to e5, which not only steps up the pressure on the d4 pawn, but prepares to bring the bishop out to b4. The main line still continues, knight to c3, and now bishop to b4, getting ready to give up a second bishop for a second knight, simply to keep the pressure in the position. And now white generally plays bishop d2, the bishop captures on c3, and b takes c3 is played when white has gained the bishop pair. In this interesting and peculiar position, white has the bishop pair, a 2-to-1 pawn majority in the center, and the opportunity to play the move e3 to e4 on the very next move. He has certainly taken some damage to his pawn structure, but I believe white can count on an advantage in this position. Generally, white is able to take a crack at the b7 pawn by playing, let's say, rook to b1, and forcing the pawn to advance and weakening the light squares on the queen side. Additionally, after the clever move queen to d6, which continues to set white some problems in achieving the move e3 to e4, white can play a clever temporary pawn sacrifice, as he does in the main line after the moves rook to b1, pawn to b6, and now here comes an interesting move, pawn to f4, e takes f4 is played, and now finally the move pawn to e4 is achieved. Since the d4 pawn is not under pressure, the e5 pawn has just been asked to capture on f4, and so in this moment, white is finally able to play e4 as the d pawn is no longer under threat. And next, white will play queen to f3. He will regain the pawn on f4, and analysis shows that white has the initiative here as the central play and the bishop pair are worth a bit more than the weakened pawn structure or any possibilities that are granted to black by the knight pair. Finally, another way for white to hold an advantage is to simply develop with the move knight to c3, putting further pressure on the d5 pawn. Now, both of the most obvious solutions are not satisfactory for black. For example, if he plays knight to f6, white simply gains control over the center with pawn takes pawn on d5, knight takes pawn on d5, and now the move pawn to e4 with a basic advantage for white. Another approach that black might try, which is not quite satisfactory, is simply to defend the pawn with pawn to e6. And in this case, white would generally continue knight to f3, knight to f6, and bishop to g5, when we suddenly have a queen's gambit declined on board, but the move knight to c6 will turn out to be quite awkward for black, since he cannot play c6 at the correct moment, or even c5, and so white will have some additional advantages in this version of the Queen's Gambit declined. So instead, after white plays the move knight to c3, what black generally does is he steams ahead with the move d takes c4, capturing a pawn, and once again staying true to the main opening principle, which is to keep pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, it's possible for white to play the move pawn to d5, and this can lead to some wild complications, but analysis shows that objectively white does not have much here. Instead, he'll want to simply play the move knight to f3, defending the d4 pawn, and just continue development quietly, preparing to play pawn to e4 and bishop takes c4. Now at this moment, if black tries the move bishop to g4, in this case the move pawn to d5 in fact is quite strong, as has been played pawn to d5, bishop takes f3, here white generally plays e takes f3, knight to e5, bishop to f4, attacking the knight, knight to g6, and now white can simply play the excellent move bishop takes c4, since the threats of bishop b5 check and queen a4 check are quite strong. And notice here the material is equal, white has excellent development and the bishop pair, and black has not succeeded at creating the sort of imbalanced situation where he has decent compensation for these factors. So this line turns out to be quite advantageous for white. Instead, black often continues more carefully with the move knight to f6, just a simple developing move. But I believe that white still has an advantage after the moves pawn to e4, just simply gaining some central space, bishop to g4, which does step up the attack on d4, but now white is able to play bishop to e3, a very comfortable move, pawn to e6, bishop takes c4, bishop b4 is generally played, and now white has an option of either playing queen c2, defending the e4 pawn, or also the very interesting move queen d3, which defends the e4 pawn and also keeps extra control over the d4 square, a factor which does come in handy in some of the variations. In both cases, white does appear to have some serious chances for a long-lasting initiative because he has achieved the central space in the center without many of the structural damages that he normally faces in other lines of the Chigorin defense. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this look at this ultra-sharp opening of the Chigorin defense. Simply by keeping pressure on the d4 pawn, black is able to create some interesting and unusual tactical possibilities, as well as positions with many unusual imbalances. Objectively though, it does appear that white has good chances of achieving an initiative if he's well prepared, but even in those cases it's not a walk in the park and the positions are still filled with plenty of interesting imbalances. That's all for today. See you soon.